You're listening to WMPG 90.9 Gorham, Portland. Live from the Orion Cygnus arm of the Milky Way galaxy, this is Scientifically Speaking, a weekly half-hour program devoted to elegant curiosities. And joining me, as always, is Bernie Rhyme, TJ Star Watcher, professor of the Astronomy Lab at USM, protector of the night skies, and the author of the monthly What's Up column in the Portland Press Herald. Today's show is a continuation, part 2 of our interview and conversation with Chase Stevens, who is a data scientist working primarily in artificial intelligence at Takeometrics, where they develop tools managing e-commerce operations. You're listening to WMPG 90.9, and joining us is Chase Stevens. And we've been talking about natural language processing and artificial intelligence. So one of the big things in the past couple of years too has been deep fakes. Where I don't know, Bernie, have you seen any of these with especially like celebrities and famous people?
Yeah,
where,
I've heard of them. I was
okay.
going to mention that next. So that's
If you watch like a video of Bush's speech on something that never happened, it's unreal. I mean, there's all these little artifacts there, but I don't even know how to, and we've been talking about speech and sound, but with video, I mean, I don't know how does that even?
Yeah, so that's actually an interesting topic. So the concept behind a deep fake is essentially it's a computer vision sort of application, and the technique that it's using is called deep learning. It's sort of an evolution of neural networks, which people might have heard of, or the perceptron model going back even further than that. But the idea is that you have something which is in some way analogous to a human brain, a very sort of simplified model of the complex neurobiology that's happening in your head. That's actually the same technique for deepfake that's also been powering a lot of the advances in natural language processing. So it seems to be emerging as this generally applicable, very powerful technique that can be applied to a very broad spectrum of problems, including video generation, like you were mentioning. The, I guess, interesting, scary part about that is with the sort of feverish research into these things also has come the democratization of tooling for these sorts of things. So it's not only that a researcher and sitting in MIT or wherever is able to do this, but then they put the code online, or at least they put the paper and quite often some code samples alongside it online, and anyone can download that and use it themselves. And so that's really where things start to get interesting, when you can have all these sort of off-the-shelf, easy-to-use models that you can immediately put into industry, or for your own sort of toy applications yourself, hobby applications. In particular, I saw, I think it was an MIT lecture from last year or something, where they had synthesized both a deep fake of President Obama welcoming the class and telling them how excited he was to have them all there, but also the voice alongside it. So these are two different models, one for synthesizing or sort of imitating someone else's voice based off your own, and one for imitating someone's video based off your own video, and just sort of combining those two off-the-shelf tools together into one very convincing video of President Obama welcoming you to this class on artificial intelligence. So that's sort of where, as these things become more and more accessible, as home computers become more and more powerful, this is where things can start to get a little tricky, or maybe a little scary from a well, where's this going standpoint.
Right. I mean, I wonder if you kind of touched on ethics a little bit, not really ethics specifically, but like at what point is it
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
I heard an analogy once, which was whenever we are doing sort of science, it's almost as if you're reaching into a jar and picking out like colored balls, right? And maybe you have 99% of the balls in there are like white balls, and it's something good for humanity. And so far we haven't picked out too many black balls, which are really bad for humanity. I think one analogy I heard was imagine if, suppose that when we were sort of in the 30s and 40s, learning more about nuclear energy and radiation and things like this, imagine that we had discovered, well, to make a nuclear bomb, all you have to do is put some sand in the microwave and microwave it. If that had been the case, we'd be in a dangerous world right now where it just so happens that it's very easy to make something incredibly destructive. That is one of the concerns with AI, is that as these tools become more ubiquitous, is it going to be the case that people are able to do some really disturbing things with them that you would like to avoid, right? So one, that's definitely been a concern of OpenAI with their GPT model. They've kept that pretty close to the vest because they're worried about people being able to generate just, lots of fake news or lots of spam or anything like that that's truly indistinguishable from what a human would write in mass quantities. You can imagine, well, if you want to just start generating conspiracy theory after conspiracy theory, one of them will apply to whoever you want to target, right? Or if you send them all out into the wild, people will start picking up on one after the other, right? And so that's one of the I guess key concerns, is making sure that even though these models, these artificial intelligence models, might not be at human levels of reasoning or planning or anything like that, even a simple model that does its job very effectively can be disastrous. And just as another example, imagine that our entire world were sort of based around playing chess. Well, whoever developed the first AI that could play chess at a better than human level would have had a really distinct advantage in the world, right? So that's the sort of thing where we do need to be pretty cautious about who has access to these models. Are they being used in a responsible way? Is the research being published in a responsible way? And trying to make sure that when we, especially with things like deep fakes, where it's very easy, especially I know it's near to the election. Imagine making some awful video of one of the candidates saying something crazy or saying something that that their party wouldn't like. That can have real impacts on the world in which we live.
Right.
Luckily, one of the things we have in our back pocket is one of the best things at determining whether something is not genuine, that something is a deep fake.
Was just gonna ask.
is through the use of artificial intelligence. So you say, all right, well, let's train a model that is able to distinguish between actual real video. And I think you alluded earlier to some of the artifacts that you saw in the video of George W. Bush, picking up on those sort of very subtle, human imperceptible giveaways in what's been generated to help differentiate that. So it's sort of a fighting fire with fire is the approach that we're moving toward, I think.
Yeah. I mean, would that be looking for like repeated pixels or something like that? Is that too simplistic?
One of the scary things about these sort of, especially deep learning models, is that we sort of understand the math behind them. We understand conceptually how they work, why they should work, those sorts of things. But if you look at an individual model and ask, well, how is it doing what it's doing? How does it know how to differentiate, your face versus your friend's face on Facebook, or your voice versus your partner's voice, or a real versus a fake video? For any particular model, trying to interpret exactly what it's doing so far has, except in the simplest cases, eluded us. There is some ongoing research because we want to understand this, but it's sort of a mystery. We don't really know how they do what they do, just like a human wouldn't be able to necessarily explain how do
Yeah.
you know how to ride a bicycle, or how do you transform this waveform that's coming into your ear into human, English language text in your head. So I can't give you necessarily a very good answer, but all that to say that these models are basically looking for repeated patterns that they can exploit to do whatever tasks they've been trained on.
Right. Man, that's like the idea of not knowing how they know what they know is really scary, actually. Because I was just gonna say that the only way you know what they're able to do is what they output. There's
yes, and it's so I guess I'm talking in a very general sense. So if you spend a lot of dedicated time, you can sort of try and figure out well what's going on, which neurons are sort of firing, which artificial neurons are sort of firing when it's doing this task, and try and infer it that way. So again, for instance, going back to GPT, one of the things that was really impressive about that is it seems to have learned in the course of, hey, I've given you some text, now predict the next word, the next word, next word. Somewhere in GPT is it's learned how to do arithmetic. And interestingly enough, one of the ways that you can tell that it actually has learned arithmetic versus sort of rote memorization of 2 + 2 = 4, 2 + 3 = 5, that it might have already seen in the vast quantities of text that's been trained on, is some of the mistakes it makes are very human mistakes. So you ask it to add two numbers together and it doesn't get the right answer, but it's because it forgot to carry the one.
Oh my God.
And so that's where things have started to get really interesting. And like I said, that model in particular is one where even today, we know that if we make that model bigger, if we give it more computational resources, and we feed more data into it, that it's so far has only gotten better and better and better. Typically, these sort of models, you feed data into them, and at a point you sort of get diminishing returns. Not so far with that model, which again sort of speaks to the true generality of deep learning as a technique.
Yeah. Just curious, how long does it take for GPT-3 to write a story? I don't know how long of a story.
So that's that's a very good question. So famously, these models are extremely computationally intensive to learn. So to do that training process, you really have to have sort of the resources of a Google, a Microsoft, a Facebook, an OpenAI. And part of that is because of our computers are not really architected today to support these sort of machine learning applications. So there are some advances on the sort of electrical engineering side that can be made to make that process a lot faster. But the interesting thing is when you have a model that has been trained, taking that model and then actually running it is very efficient. So you can do it on your phone or your home laptop or whatever.
Right. How many, so like GPT, could it, right now, can you tell it, I want you to write a 1 hour long, like, reading wise, it takes 1 hour, mystery novel, and it could, does it go like that in genre like that?
So the answer is yes, but you have to know how to sort of prompt it, right? So the general idea is GPT has been trained on basically all the text that OpenAI could find. I think actually the technique they used for the latest version of that, GPT-3, they went through the sort of link aggregator Reddit, and every link on Reddit, they went to that website and got all the text from that link. So when you can online, not GPT-3, but GPT-2, you can find websites where you can sort of play around with it. It responds in basically real time, slightly dependent on what parameters you have set, but and the way that you sort of get it to produce the sort of things you're talking about is you have to give it some sort of prompt to start off with. So for instance, you might say, start out with, it was a dark and stormy night. Detective Sarah had just been informed that blah, 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 and then ask to continue on that. And it picks up on those first few sentences to decide, well, what is the context here?
Mhm.
What sort of words would follow from something that started in this way? And that's sort of one of the nice tricks to it, is that what makes it so general is that it will respond to a wide range of prompts. So you can start out that way. You can say, start out with something that looks more like an interview, where you have Sarah, hello, Bernie, how are you? Bernie, hi, I'm fine, Sarah, how are you? Et cetera, and have it continue on that. You can have it do things like test taking. So you can say, question, how would you write a simple sign up web page? Answer, and have it fill in the rest of that, and it will generate a valid web page for you that does what you asked it to do. So that's essentially how you end up interacting with that particular model.
Wow, it feels like this model can probably better read social situations than some of us who are like very anxious in social situations.
Well, so it's important to it is an extremely impressive model. It's important to note that it's not a human, right? It is only truly deeply under the hood, only trying to say, for all words in the English language, what's the probability of that word coming next, given what I've seen so far? But it doesn't do a very good job necessarily of sort of building a model of the world, right?
Mm.
So there are cases where, for instance, you can say, Chase put down the class on the desk, then he walked to the bedroom, then he did yada, 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 then he, went outside, then he came back, where is the glass? And it won't necessarily have tracked that because it doesn't have this sort of consistent model of what's going on necessarily. It just is looking at the individual words that it's seen before and trying to guess, well, we've talked about glasses, we've talked about bedrooms, we've talked about going outside. What word would normally come next in this sort of situation? So it's sort of it's a little bit of a parlor trick in some ways, but on the other hand, some of the more interesting aspects of it, like it seeming to have some limited understanding of arithmetic, point to, as we scale these models up, they might start to have that sort of holistic view of the world that you and I have.
Yeah. Would you say that any of the things that GPT has written are creative or surprising?
So creative is an interesting word because it's sort of one of these moving goalposts. AI, again, back in the 80s, 90s, one of the sort of bars that was set was, well, chess is an inherently creative endeavor. An artificial intelligence will never be able to play chess because that sort of requires this human spirit to, think about, what the psychology of what your opponent's doing and what am I doing, and sort of reading their minds, and the artistry of assuming a position, and the feints and sleights and all this sort of stuff. And it turns out when you break that problem down, it's not so hard. A computer doesn't play chess at all in the same way that a human does.
Right.
But in terms of the actual task, it doesn't matter. So when we talk about creativity, it is sort of, I think part of creativity is coming up with sort of novel solutions that are unexpected, that are surprising. And that in some ways is directly against what the system is trying to do. So it's trying to predict what's most likely to come next, as opposed to something truly novel and innovative. And as an example of this, I think that there has been some attempts to apply that model to scientific research. So I've started a paper, now you finish this research paper, and it doesn't understand physics or astronomy or anything like that. So it just produces total garbage, right? But on the other hand, in terms of creativity from like an entertainment value perspective, or something like that, it does do a pretty good job, because it can produce essentially these infinite new works. You can just keep asking it for more and more and more and more, and it will give you more and more and more and more. And you can sort of slightly adjust, well, how novel or how improbable is the next thing that you're going to produce, and have it be a little more creative in that sort of sense. But again, creativity is a really difficult thing to define,
Right.
and something that as humans we sort of have this tacit understanding of, and it doesn't always apply consistently to when we're talking about sort of systematizing the creative process.
Sure. Wow.
Well, you said you can write poetry. I always see that as creative, and you can write music, and that's creative.
Well, so it sort of depends. Are you? I guess if you were a scholar of poetry, you might look at a work and say, "Oh, this is very derivative. This is, pretty, banal or whatever."
Yeah.
But if you're a layperson like I am, looking at poetry it's produced, it looks like realistic poetry, and some of the poetry that it produces is, quite touching, quite beautiful, right? So I don't know. It's sort of what really counts as being creative, right? Is it being able to elicit these emotions or give people sort of joy, or is it coming up with truly novel, unique things? Or I don't know how to define the line there necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, there's I don't know if you've heard of this website called InspiroBot. It's like it's a bot that generates kind of inspirational quotes. And so it's basically been fed all of the inspirational quotes from all across the internet, and it'll use kind of some of the basic patterns that these inspirational quotes use, and then just fill in random words. I think one of the things when you flip through them, you'll kind of go through like 90% are trash, but then you'll come across one where you're like, wow, this is so deep. It has so much meaning. But like, that's just us, interpreting it.
Yes, that is very true. That a lot of times we're sort of, meeting things halfway as humans, because our brains are sort of primed to be recognizing these things, right? Just like you might see a face in the clouds. Does it really look like a face, really, if you deeply looked at it? No, it's not. It probably doesn't have eyebrows, or it just doesn't look like a face. But our brains are similarly these sort of pattern matching machines, and that's sort of what being able to recognize patterns, being able to understand, oh, when there's a rustle of leaves, maybe I should infer that there's something over there in the tall grass or whatever, are what our brains have been sort of evolved to do. And so yes, we do sort of meet halfway in that we are very generous in trying to interpret things we see. And it's even sometimes a problem in human cognition when you say, if you present people with ridiculous scenarios like, oh, you couldn't imagine someone selling their house for $1. Immediately, what most people will think of, is, oh, well, maybe there's this circumstance where you would sell your house for $1, or maybe this other circumstance, or yada, 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 to try and explain these very improbable happenstances. Likewise, when you're looking at the output of an AI, you might explicitly not be thinking about this in your head, but somewhere in your subconscious, you're trying to get the most charitable and useful for you interpretation of what's been written.
Yeah. In a lot of ways, the AI reminds me of, say, for example, a pet dog, where I mean, because you train them and they recognize patterns. But when you do something weird or different, they're kind of like, huh? Like what? And they don't, and they don't interpret things like, we buy toys for them that we think are cute. They don't care. They don't care how it looks. They don't care that it's this like pumpkin, and they just care that it has this squeaky thing in it, and that represents toy. So in a lot of ways, it kind of reminds me of, animal level. There's not really any interpretation there. They're just basing their perception of things or their understanding of things from like patterns.
Yeah, and that's actually another I guess another trick of the trade, if you will, in terms of how these systems work is if you actually look at the mental capabilities and adaptiveness of a dog's brain, it's many, many, many orders of magnitude better than what AI can produce today, right? A dog has no problem sort of venturing out into the world. Well, I don't know, it depends on the dog maybe, but venturing out into the world and, surviving on its own and understanding new situations that it hasn't come across before. They actually do a pretty good job of that. Artificial intelligence right now is way below that level. So we're talking about, cognitive resources that are, on insect or less sort of levels, right? But we are able to have those models be successful because they're trained on sort of very narrow tasks, right? This GPT model understands the English language, but it doesn't understand the world. It doesn't understand,
Right.
If you put it into a survival quote unquote situation and said, you're in a ravine, you have an oar and blah, 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 what should you do to survive? It's not going to give you the right answer. It doesn't understand how to play chess, probably. It doesn't understand, how to see things and how to integrate what it's seeing with what it's hearing, with what it's, so that's really out of our reach right now in terms of what we can achieve in the state of the art. But you don't always need to have a truly intelligent agent to be able to do very impressive tasks, or you don't always need to have something that understands the entire world. You can sort of assemble together these bits and pieces of different models to achieve what you want in a way where you don't have to have that true understanding in the palm of your hand, but you're still able to produce the results that you're looking for, if that makes any sense.
Sure. So do you think that if we are trying to create kind of a robotic human, trying to mimic all the things that our brains can do you think that, I know you say we're kind of at just not even the baby stages of artificial intelligence, but, is that, to achieve that, do you think that's just going to be a lot of these different kinds of models added together, or is it going to be something completely different?
It's so hard, it's very, we just don't know really right now how to get from where we are to true general intelligence, because there's so many pieces missing. Like I said, a lot of these successes have been driven by these sort of labeled training sets, right? Where you say, ahead of time, here's the situation, or here's the input, here's what I want you to produce, here's the output, right?
Right.
No such thing exists for, the conversation we're having right now. There's no right answer for what I should say next, right? There are many wrong answers. If I started speaking total gibberish, that wouldn't play very well, I imagine. But there's no one particular right answer, right? And likewise, in the sort of very rich world in which we find ourselves on a day-to-day basis, there's no right answer for how exactly should I take my next step? How exactly should I, how do I go about planning? Well, it's hard because for humans, so much of this is implicit and we don't have to think about it at all. But if you think about something like, okay, I want to, buy a candy bar or something, right? Well, first I have to recognize I'm hungry. How do I satisfy my hunger? Oh, maybe one example is a candy bar. I have to figure out, well, where do candy bars exist? How do I procure the candy bar? I have to have money to pay for it. How do I get the money? How do I get to the place that sells the candy bars? What if they don't have them? All that sort of more advanced planning work is way beyond our capabilities right now.
You've been listening to Scientifically Speaking here on WMPG with myself, Bernie, and Chase Stevens. This was part 2 of a 3-part series. So if you want to check out the rest of the conversation and interview, listen to next week's episode. Stay tuned for Sports Jam with Cullen and Connor. And from your favorite nerds, mask up, and we wish you healthy bodies and clean air. You are listening to WMPG 90.9 Gorham, Portland.